Deep in the bowels of Belarus, something wicked is stirring, something that has been building slowly, quietly, piece by piece, roads being carved out of frozen earth, artillery positions rising from the ground, missile systems being rolled into launch-ready positions. And at the center of it all, a dictator who has spent the last 4 years pretending he's still in control while the man in the Kremlin pulls every single string. This is the story of a country that may be about to do the unthinkable, a country that is being dragged or is walking willingly toward a war it has no real reason to fight, and a story that could change the entire shape of the conflict in Ukraine, not because Belarus is powerful, but because of what its involvement would force Ukraine to do. Because here's the thing, you don't need to win on the battlefield to shift the entire course of a war. You just need to show up. Stay with us. Because the 3 scenarios we're going to lay out today are not hypothetical war games. They are real possibilities that Ukraine's military planners are actively preparing for right now. And if you want to understand how this conflict could escalate in ways that almost nobody is talking about, you need to hear all 3. And if this kind of deep dive analysis is what keeps you informed, make sure you hit subscribe to States News right now. We cover developments like this every single week with the depth they deserve. Let's start with the man behind the curtain. Well, the puppet in front of the curtain. Alexander Lukashenko has, in the span of a few days, made a series of statements that should alarm anyone paying attention. As reported by United 24 Media on May 12th, Belarus's president declared that his country is going to begin what he called selective mobilization, pulling military units out of their routine, getting them into combat readiness, and preparing them for what he called war. His exact words were striking in their framing. We will selectively mobilize units in order to prepare them for war. God willing, it can be avoided. Read those words carefully. He didn't say, we are preparing our defenses. He didn't say, we are responding to NATO provocations. He said, prepare for war and hope to God it doesn't come. That is not the language of a man who believes the danger is abstract. That is the language of a man who thinks war is coming and is getting his country ready for it, whether his people want it or not. That meeting with Defense Minister Viktor Krenin was no ordinary check-in. According to reporting from the same outlet, it followed military readiness drills involving 6,000 reservists and military personnel, drills specifically designed to test the combat readiness of troops and the logistical and transport procedures Belarus would need if it ever went to war. And Lukashenko didn't just talk about mobilization in that meeting. He talked about modernization. He talked about weapons. He talked about the future. It is impossible to accomplish defense objectives without equipping our troops with modern weapons, Lukashenko stated. We must have weapons that we can actually use, know how to operate, which, read between the lines, is essentially an admission that the Belarusian army is currently using systems it doesn't fully understand. Old Soviet-era equipment, outdated training, a military that looks larger on paper than it is in reality. He went further. Lukashenko laid out a 5-year armament program, the 2026 to 2030 plan, with the explicit goal of bringing modern systems up to 45% of Belarus's total military equipment. He emphasized that airstrikes alone are not enough in modern warfare. Without a ground operation, it is impossible, he said. He wants boots on the ground. He wants real warfighting capability. And the direction that capability is being aimed could not be more obvious. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because none of this came out of nowhere. Go back to April 17th. That's when the Kyiv Independent reported on a statement by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had received intelligence indicating that Belarus was building new roads toward the Ukrainian border and establishing fresh artillery positions along the entire northern frontier. Zelensky was direct. We believe that Russia will once again attempt to drag Belarus into its war. Those weren't hollow words. They were based on satellite imagery and intelligence assessments that had been building for months. By May, the pieces were clicking together even faster. As Euromaidan Press reported, Ukrainian officials had received new intelligence indicating that Russia was actively discussing scenarios involving Belarus-based military operations that could target not just Ukraine, but potentially NATO member states. Zelensky responded by announcing that Ukraine would specifically strengthen the Chernihiv-Kyiv direction of defense. That is the direction that faces Belarus. That is where Ukraine now believes the next serious threat will come from. But here's the critical question. Is Putin actually going to push Lukashenko into this war? And the answer, based on everything we know, is yes. Of course he would. He's done it before. Let's remember what happened in February 2022. In the weeks before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the BBC was reporting on a series of joint military drills between Russia and Belarus. At the time, Putin was insisting, lying openly, that Russia had no plans to invade Ukraine. Then the drills ended, and almost immediately, Russian forces crossed into Ukraine via Belarusian territory, driving directly toward Kyiv. Lukashenko didn't just allow this, he enabled it. He gave Putin's forces a launching pad, a supply corridor, and a strategic front that Ukraine had never prepared for. Lukashenko acknowledged as much eventually in August 2023, though he went to extraordinary lengths to insist that not a single Belarusian was involved in the invasion, which is technically true if you ignore the fact that the president of Belarus personally authorized Russian troops to use his country's soil to invade a neighbor. That's not neutrality. That's co-belligerence wrapped in diplomatic language. And it didn't stop there. In December 2025, Al Jazeera reported a chilling detail from President Zelensky. Russian forces were using ordinary apartment buildings in Belarus, 5-story residential blocks, as platforms for drone guidance equipment. Antennae and electronic systems installed on civilian rooftops to help guide Russian Shahed drones toward targets in Ukraine's western regions. Belarus was not a passive bystander. Belarus was the relay station. And now comes the Oreshnik. This is the detail that takes the Belarus story from alarming to genuinely terrifying in its implications. In December 2025, Russia's Ministry of Defense announced it had forward deployed its Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile system to Belarus. As reported by Army Recognition, Lukashenko confirmed the deployment and called it defensive. Nobody in the analytical community believed that. The Jamestown Foundation noted that the deployment of such a strike system close to a potential theater of operations typically indicates preparations for offensive action, not defensive deterrence. The Oreshnik is not a small weapon. This is a nuclear-capable ballistic missile system capable, according to arms control analysts, of striking Berlin, Paris, and London. It was first fired in combat conditions against the Ukrainian city of Dnipro in November 2024. And during the Zapad 2025 joint exercises held in September, which involved more than 13,000 military personnel and prompted Poland to completely close its border with Belarus, Belarusian Chief of General Staff Pavel Muravenko confirmed that his forces had specifically practiced deploying the Oreshnik system. Among the key activities, I can mention the planning and consideration of the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons and the assessment and deployment of the Oreshnik mobile missile system, Muravenko said. Let that sink in. Belarus was practicing nuclear weapon deployment as part of a military exercise, and then they received the actual system. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, President Zelensky called on NATO to treat the Oreshnik deployed in Belarus as a legitimate military target. He should not play games, Zelensky said, referring to Lukashenko, because after these steps, the Russians will bring Oreshnik into Belarus without even consulting Lukashenko. That last part is significant because it points to the real dynamic at work here. Putin is not asking Lukashenko. He is informing him. And slowly, Belarus is being converted from a sovereign ally into an annex of Russia's war machine. This is the context for everything that Lukashenko is now saying. The mobilization talk, the weapons programs, the road construction to the Ukrainian border. This isn't Lukashenko building up Belarusian power. This is Lukashenko being handed a script by Moscow and reading it out loud, while simultaneously trying to convince his own people that he's still the one in charge. And that brings us to the three scenarios that every serious analyst of this conflict is now watching closely. But before we dig into those, if you're watching States News for the first time, this is what we do. We take the noise of international news and we break it down into something real, something analytical, something that actually helps you understand what's happening. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next, because in the weeks ahead, the situation along Ukraine's northern border could change very fast. Scenario 1, Belarus mobilizes but does not invade. On the surface, this sounds like the best-case outcome for Ukraine. Belarus calls up its reserves, moves forces toward the border, rattles its swords, and stops. No troops cross the frontier. No shots are fired in Ukrainian territory. But this is still dangerous, enormously dangerous, because it forces Ukraine to respond. According to Global Security, Ukraine currently maintains a contingent of approximately 14,000 soldiers along the Belarus border. That number has been in place for several years, and it comes with layers of fortification, mines, anti-vehicle obstacles, fortified positions that Ukraine's State Border Guard Service has been expanding since August 2022. As spokesman Andriy Demchenko explained back in February, this direction is reinforced by various components of our country's defense forces, and the state borderline itself is also being fortified with fortifications along the border so that all Ukrainian soldiers, all components of the defense forces located in this direction, have every opportunity to counter any threat that may come from the territory of Belarus. Those 14,000 soldiers and those fortifications cover a 1,000-kilometer border. If Belarus mobilizes, and according to Global Firepower, Belarus has 63,000 active military personnel and 365,400 reserves who can be called up, then 14,000 Ukrainian troops is nowhere near enough. Ukraine would be forced to pull forces from the east, from Donetsk, from Zaporizhzhia, from the sectors where Russia is currently pressing its hardest. That is the point. That is the entire strategic calculation. The ISAN's analytical group noted in its April 2026 military review that while no substantial Belarusian buildup was currently observed near the Ukrainian border, the gradual adaptation of Belarus's military system, counter-UAV development, enhanced mobilization capabilities, infrastructure construction was consistent with preparing for a protracted regional confrontation. Not tomorrow, not next month, but building steadily towards something. The diversion strategy is Russia's most valuable weapon right now. Every Ukrainian soldier and every Ukrainian drone stationed along the Belarusian border is a soldier and a drone that isn't stopping Russian advances in Donetsk. That is the math that Moscow is doing. And that is why even a mobilization without an invasion is a gift to Putin. Scenario 2. Belarus drives toward Kyiv. Here's where it becomes genuinely alarming. In this scenario, Lukashenko follows through. He sends his mobilized forces south, repeating the opening gambit of Putin's February 2022 invasion, the one that nearly decapitated Ukraine's government in the first weeks of the war. The distance from Narolya in southern Belarus to the outskirts of Kyiv is less than 170 kilometers as the crow flies. That is not a vast expanse of territory. It is not the kind of distance that provides Ukraine with unlimited reaction time. The Hudson Institute reported, following a visit to Kyiv by one of its analysts, that seemingly new fortifications had been constructed, pointing directly toward the Belarusian border. Those fortifications, part of Ukraine's layered defensive preparations, are significant. But the key question is whether a mobilized Belarusian army, potentially numbering 420,000 combined active and reserve personnel, plus 55,000 paramilitary troops, could overwhelm those defenses before Ukraine can reinforce. A Belarusian push on Kyiv is unlikely to succeed. Let's be clear about that. Belarus's military has minimal modern combat experience. The country's last significant external military involvement was the first Libyan civil war in 2011, where it ended up on the losing side. Against a Ukrainian army that has been fighting, adapting, and innovating for over 4 years, an army that is destroying approximately 35,000 Russian casualties per month, according to ongoing tracking of the conflict, Belarusian forces would face devastating attrition. As Istory's media analysis noted in April 2026, citing Artyom Brukhan of the Belarusian Opposition Coordination Council, Lukashenko himself is acutely aware that dragging Belarus into the war could be politically suicidal. There is public consensus on the idea he himself has been selling to Belarusians in recent years. I have ensured you peace. You are not fighting, Brukhan said. Mobilizing and invading Ukraine would shatter that claim. It could ignite the kind of popular backlash that nearly brought down Lukashenko's government in 2020 when mass protests engulfed the country following his fraudulent re-election in August of that year. But here's what none of that matters to Putin. Putin does not need Belarusian forces to take Kyiv. He doesn't even want them to. What he wants is for Ukrainian forces to flood north, for Ukrainian air defense systems to shift positions, for Ukrainian reserves to be pulled away from Donetsk at the exact moment Russia is applying maximum pressure there. If Belarusian forces advance on Kyiv and die in the tens of thousands, Putin loses nothing. He never had those soldiers. They belong to Lukashenko. But the strategic gain, a Ukraine forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously, that gain belongs entirely to the Kremlin. Scenario 3. Belarus strikes into western Ukraine. This one may be the most sophisticated and the most dangerous of the three because it targets Ukraine's lifeline rather than its capital. In this scenario, Belarusian forces don't drive toward Kyiv. They drive west, toward Lviv, toward the Polish border, toward the critical supply corridors through which the vast majority of Western military aid reaches Ukraine's fighting forces in the east. Think about the geometry of this. Ukraine's current front line stretches approximately 1,200 kilometers. If Belarus moves into western Ukraine, that front line doesn't just extend, it wraps around. Ukraine would face a front from the east, the south, and now the northwest, a line that could stretch toward 2,000 kilometers, more than a 60% increase in territory that Ukrainian forces would need to defend. But the truly devastating element of this scenario isn't the raw territorial pressure, it's the sabotage dimension. In this model, Belarus wouldn't necessarily need to conduct a full-scale armored invasion. Small units, special forces, infiltration teams, strike groups with a single purpose: destroy the railway lines, the road bridges, the logistics hubs through which NATO weapons flow into Ukraine, disrupt the supply chain, slow the convoys, cut the arteries. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the same playbook that military analysts have been warning about since 2022 as the most dangerous potential use of Belarusian territory, not as a launching pad for tanks, but as a gateway for attrition against Ukraine's rear areas. And it would work. Not because it would defeat Ukraine, but because it would compound the pressure in Donetsk, where Ukraine's defenders are already relying on a constant flow of artillery shells, drones, and equipment to hold the line. Slow that flow, and the line weakens. The line weakens, and Russia advances. Russia advances, and Donetsk becomes harder to hold. Donetsk becomes harder to hold, and suddenly a Belarusian infiltration operation in the west has produced strategic consequences across the entire 1,200-kilometer front. This is the scenario Ukraine has been quietly preparing for. But preparation and certainty are not the same thing. Let's talk about what Ukraine actually has going for it in all three of these scenarios, because this is not a helpless situation. First, the fortifications. Ukraine has been building layered defenses along its 1,000-kilometer Belarusian border since August 2022. The work includes blown bridges, mined zones, reinforced positions, anti-vehicle obstacles, and more recently, as reporting from iStory suggested in April 2026, the same kind of drone wall that Ukraine used to slow Russian advances on other sections of the front. These fortifications represent years of investment and strategic thinking. They are not a guarantee, but they are a significant deterrent. Second, intelligence. Ukraine has demonstrated throughout this conflict a remarkable capacity for real-time monitoring of Belarusian military activity. The reports about road construction, artillery positions, reserve mobilization calls, Ukraine knows about these things as they happen. As Demchenko stated, Ukraine is continuously monitoring the situation. That monitoring buys time. Time to reinforce, time to position, time to activate reserves before a threat materializes. Third, long-range strike capability. Here is the factor that Lukashenko should be thinking about the most, but probably isn't. Ukraine has demonstrated its willingness to strike deep into Russian territory, oil refineries, military storage depots, command facilities. If Belarus invades Ukraine, those same long-range drones and missiles will be pointed north. Belarus has no significant experience absorbing that kind of sustained strike campaign. Its military infrastructure, its fuel depots, its command nodes, All of it becomes a target the moment Belarusian forces cross the border. And then there is NATO. This is the dimension that may ultimately determine whether Lukashenko ever gives the order. Poland and Lithuania share borders with Belarus to the west and northwest. The Suwałki Gap, that narrow strip of land between Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, is one of the most sensitive points on NATO's entire eastern flank. As TVP World reported in early May, both Poland and Lithuania took part in NATO-led drills called Brave Griffin, focused specifically on rapid force deployment and allied coordination in the event NATO needs to defend or close the Suwałki Gap. Those drills matter. They send a message. If Belarus makes a serious military move into Ukraine, Poland and Lithuania must calculate whether that represents an expansion of Russia's war to their own doorstep. And if they decide it does, NATO's Article 5 framework, the Mutual Defense Clause, becomes relevant in ways that Russia would find very difficult to manage. Lukashenko is not thinking about NATO. He is, as he always is, thinking about Putin. But if his mobilization triggers a NATO response along his western border, he would find himself fighting not just Ukraine, but squeezed between two fronts, a situation that would shatter the Belarusian military within weeks. And Putin knows this too, which is why the more likely scenario for now remains the subtle one: the infrastructure games, the mobilization rhetoric, the Oreshnik missiles sitting on launchers in the Belarusian countryside, capable of striking London and Paris, held over Europe's head like a threat designed to keep NATO from responding too forcefully to anything Russia does in Ukraine. That is the real game. And Lukashenko is the board that Putin is playing on. What is particularly grim about this situation is what it says about Lukashenko's trajectory over the past decade. Here's a man who, in 2020, stole an election and held on to power by brutalizing his own people, protesters beaten, thrown into prisons, forced into exile. A man who maintained power only because Putin backed him. And now, as the price of that backing, Lukashenko is being required to deliver his country as an asset in someone else's war. The communications equipment on Belarusian apartment rooftops. The Russian drones guided over Belarusian territory to strike Ukrainian cities, the Oreshnik launchers, the shared military exercises, the roads being carved toward the Ukrainian border. Each of these is another link in a chain that is slowly wrapping itself around whatever sovereignty Belarus has left. And the population that Lukashenko claims to protect? They have no idea what is being done in their name. The people living in those apartment blocks that host Russian drone guidance systems, do they know? The reservists being called up and assessed for combat readiness, do they want to fight Ukraine? The 2020 protests suggest that large segments of the Belarusian population are deeply hostile to Lukashenko's direction. An actual war with Ukraine could be the match that lights that powder keg. But that calculation of popular backlash, of domestic instability, of the political suicide involved in sending Belarusian soldiers to die in Ukraine, all of that assumes Lukashenko still has enough agency left to make it. The evidence increasingly suggests that he doesn't. When Putin wants something, Lukashenko delivers it. That has been the consistent pattern since 2020. And right now, what Putin wants is a second front. So what happens next? The most likely near-term scenario, according to the pattern of events and the intelligence picture Ukraine has shared publicly, is continued escalation without immediate invasion. More road construction, more artillery positions, more reserve drills, more Oreshnik deployments, more rhetoric from Lukashenko about being ready for war. All of it designed to pin down Ukrainian forces in the north without firing a shot. But history has a habit of accelerating when nobody is expecting it to. Russia's initial invasion in 2022 was dismissed as impossible by many analysts until the day it began. The Zapad 2025 exercises were framed as routine until Poland closed its border and Latvia shut down crossings, and the whole of Eastern Europe went on alert. The Oreshnik deployment was described as a bluff until the missiles were on the ground. At some point, the preparation becomes the operation. Ukraine understands this. That is why Zelensky announced the strengthening of the Chernihiv-Kyiv direction. That is why the state border guard is building fortifications across all 1,000 kilometers of the Belarusian frontier. That is why Ukraine is monitoring every convoy, every construction project, every military movement in Belarus in real time. Ukraine is not caught off guard, but Ukraine is also fighting a war on multiple existing fronts with finite resources. And every soldier and drone and shell deployed to face the Belarusian threat is a soldier and drone and shell that isn't stopping Russia in Donetsk. That is the genius, if you can call it that, of Putin's Belarus strategy. He doesn't need Belarus to win. He needs Belarus to drain. And if Lukashenko can be pushed far enough, that drain becomes a flood. The situation in Belarus is not just a regional concern. It is a direct window into the way Russia wages war, not just with missiles and infantry, but with pressure, with positioning, with the long game of forcing your enemy to defend everywhere at once. Ukraine has survived this kind of multi-directional pressure before. It survived 2022. It survived 2023 and 2024. It has adapted and innovated in ways that military analysts around the world are still studying. But the Northern Front is now active in a way it wasn't before. The roads being built toward the border, the artillery positions being established, the Oreshnik missiles on Belarusian soil, the mobilization rhetoric, the reserve drills. None of these are coincidences. None of these are routine. Something is building in Belarus. And whether it erupts in weeks or months or is held in check by the fear of Belarusian popular revolt and NATO response, that answer will shape the outcome of this war as much as anything happening right now in Donetsk. We will, of course, keep you updated every step of the way as this situation develops. The Northern Front is going to matter. And when it does, you'll want to already understand the pieces on the board. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to States News now and hit the notification bell. This is the kind of depth we bring every week. We are not going to stop covering this because neither is Putin. Thanks for watching.